Hello and welcome to the show. Mystery Go and the Feral Monk back again here to wrap up season 2 on our yoga podcast. Today is the final limb in the 8 limbs of Ashtanga as described by Patanjali. And today we're going to be discussing Samadhi. And Samadhi loosely translates to absorption in Sanskrit. And it also is kind of culturally related to India, pertaining to death. Like when someone really important, like a great yogi or saint, passes away, that's their Maha Samadhi, their great death. So yeah, right away I'm gonna hand it off to Mr. Monk. Hope you're doing well today, Mr. Monk, and love for you just to kick it off and give us some good bits on Samadhi and how all the limbs relate to that.
Yeah, man, I'm doing good and just happy to be having these talks. It's been a good year of conversation. So it's nice to wrap up a second season of anything, but especially a second season on these kinds of topics, because they actually have application in our lives.
Absolutely.
They might seem unimportant, but if the average person were to really analyze the sufferings and the things that happen to them in their lives and their reactions, and everyone has these kinds of regrets, like, I shouldn't have reacted that way, and but rarely do we stop and think of, well, where do those reactions coming from? Is it possible maybe to not be so reactive and maybe not fall into so many pits along the path of life? So as you were saying, yes, Samadhi is the 8th limb in Patanjali's system, and it does have connotations to death. What it makes me think of, Maha Samadhi, whenever a great yogi dies, and it's called their Maha Samadhi, as a greater death. What makes me think of is well, it sort of implies that there's a smaller death that must have already happened, and because they've, as a yogi, they've probably attained Samadhi already before their death.
Mm-hmm.
So if it has this connotation to death, well, what is it that's dying?
Yeah.
What is this death representing? What is it in us that is dying? And before we dive straight into that, I would like to also kind of sort of pull up to that idea with reminding us of these different limbs that we've gone through to get to this point, right? Because we're kind of talking about sort of a process of self-discovery, of refining our character, developing our character. And so, with the first 2 limbs, we start off with more like moral precepts, you could say, things that have much more ethical in nature and external in nature.
Yamas and niyamas.
The yamas and the niyamas. Then we moved on to asana. And asana is sort of like our first opportunity to sort of explore the body. And so we discovered tensions and holding patterns and muscle memory and sort of got to the task of loosening some of those physical knots in us that cause unwanted suffering. We gain flexibility and strength. We have a body that feels good to inhabit at this point. And so we moved on to pranayam. As far as like stages, most likely we're incorporating pranayam into the asana itself. And so we've expanded our breath, but we've consolidated our concentration. The body was a very large object of concentration. The breath is a more subtle one. And so we were refining and strengthening that concentration. And then in that series of stages, with that understanding that we gained about the physical world, a lot of people stop already there. And that's fine. No harm in that. But if you continue on, you're going to eventually want to find out what's going on inside. How am I doing in here? And what do I mean with I when I'm saying, how am I doing? Mm-hmm. These kind of questions should kind of naturally arise out of this process. And so pratyahara is where we started to turn that attention toward the inside and the inner landscapes, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, are even subtler than the breath. So we had to refine and strengthen our concentration again and then so that we aren't taken away with our feelings or taken away by our thoughts into different directions. But we saw the utility and the value in remaining focused on our awareness of the inner landscape as a whole. That level or that quality of concentration spawns dhyana. It births this type of meditative state of concentrated awareness on the inner landscape as it is. And part of that, seeing it for what it is implying insight. So that's in dhyana, at the culmination of dhyana, we've sort of come to the point where we've discovered the ahamkara in yoga. And ahamkara simply translates to the I maker. So there is this phenomenon mentally inside of us that has created an entire series of associated identities and stories around this central figure of I. And it's an orientation that is quite necessary for operation in the external world. And it very often goes unquestioned. You know, when I talk about me, I'm talking about me. What do you mean me? What do you mean which I? What do you mean, you know?
Right. So it's a subconscious thing almost.
Yeah, and it's just taken for granted. You know,
Mhm.
Everyone's been telling you your whole life what your name is and what you like and you don't like and what you're good at and you're not.
What's your favorite
good at.
color?
And where you should work and what kind of job you should have and what kind of wife you should have or a husband or whatever, how many children, or, you know, everyone's got an opinion on everything, you know.
Yep.
And we've sort of collected all of those things plus our own reflections on them, and we've sort of developed this story of I. And we've come to identify our very being with the story itself. And so this story is sort of coloring everything that we see and experience in our external world, but it's also coloring and influencing how the inner world is developing as well. And so we're gaining insights into this sort of our tendency towards pleasure, away from pain, our likes and dislikes are becoming much more clear to us, and the games that the mind is playing with us, leading us around to get what it wants, you know, almost like a junkie needs its fix of whatever it is, of a thrill or adrenaline or peace or anger or whatever. You know, it's for the body itself at the cellular level, it makes no difference. The receptors for your emotions are the same receptors on the cells that are used for heroin to dock on and for other drugs to dock on. So for the body itself, it can be addicted to mental states, you know, to subtle mental states, and the mind will lead your actions to the fulfillment of those addictive urgings.
Yes.
And so all of this game is becoming clear in dhyana, but it's arising. It's not you trying to take
easier to solve.
Yeah, and it's not you trying to take information externally and stuff it into the, you know, to superimpose upon it and be like, oh, that's that, and that's that, and that's that. And it's arising naturally in your patient attentiveness to that landscape.
Yeah.
And whenever those insights reach a culmination, the very story of I that we've lived with our whole lives becomes obviously false. We can see the falsity of it, and it's in a very obvious way. It's not something that you have to then second guess or anything else. It's extremely clear that this I is just a collection of stories and ideas and has no reality except for the one we give it.
Yeah.
And so when that culmination is attained, samadhi arises. And so whenever we were talking about earlier about death, what we're talking about here is an ego death.
Yeah.
You know, and so if we're talking about the ego death, you know, we don't want to be vague about it. What do we mean by ego? And it's that collection of stories centered around this idea of I
identity
that has that has a history. It has maybe an ethnic background or a cultural background. It has desires. It has a history of mistakes and follies and triumphs, and it's a very compelling story. You know, it's one that we're familiar with and it feels very close to us. But at this particular moment, when that dissolves, whenever that story dissolves through the understanding of our own experiential knowledge, actually seeing it in ourselves,
For what it
then
is.
yeah, then that's where the ego death happens, right? This I is no longer able to be seen as real. It can become a very fun, creative thing to play with, but it's no longer seen as real. And so that the danger of its deception has been eliminated, you know?
Yes.
And so that ego death then in samadhi, or purifying the mind, or, you know, these sentences that get thrown around all the time, you know, what are you purifying? You're purifying all this collected story and feelings and emotions and ideas. That's what you're purifying out. And if you're purifying something, and it sort of implies that something is impure to it. And if something is impure, like a pure stone, means that it's only made up of that particular substance for that stone. If it's an emerald, if it's a pure emerald, it's only made up of emerald. If there's something else admixed into that emerald, it's an impure emerald. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the mind and stuff as well. What is it that isn't natural to the mind, and therefore tainting it or causing it to be impure, and purifying that out is this story. So when you're purifying the mind, you're purifying of its obsession with the I story. When that happens, the fluctuations in our consciousness, this constant ebb and flow of thoughts and ideas, and begin to dissolve, right? And so then you've attained the goal of Patanjali's yoga, which is already in the second sentence of the book, in the first chapter, which is entitled the Samadhi Pada, or the Samadhi chapter. The second sentence is Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. And that is translated as yoga is the cessation of fluctuations in consciousness, right? And so now we talked about it in an earlier episode, but now it should be much clearer what that means, right? It's the cessation of these obsessive, non-real story mechanisms running on autopilot inside of us, leading us into unskillful actions and emotions and thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that would be samadhi, the small death, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like, I don't know, at least my ego wants to paint it this way. It sounds scary when it's you know, talked about as an ego death, and like an ego erosion, like, sounds much friendlier to me. And so, like, you know, I can see, like, in my mind, where the erosion of the ego, you know, through the practice of the limbs, can achieve that kind of samadhi state. But like when I hear ego death, it just sounds like, oh man, my ego is like, no.
Everyone's ego is like, no, please.
Yeah. Why does it hang on so strong? Why is its grip so tight and on our minds, do you think? Why does it want to survive so much?
Well, it's a survival necessity, right?
Yeah.
In order to operate in the world, you need something to orient from, like some type of center of orientation that you can move from, you know, that you can act in the world through. But I was thinking while you were talking about it, it came to me sort of the idea of ego death and erosion of the ego. We could also just call it like the simplicity of confusing the story of yourself with yourself. It's just a confusion of the story being you, you know. So we can take away a little bit the heavier connotations of death.
Yeah.
But like imagine
it's not all about us. It's not all about you, you know. It's really not.
Definitely not. It's really not. Definitely not. But in Patanjali's time, you would imagine, like, okay, there's not this worldwide internet full of every discovery and info of every human being ever in history, and access to your pocket on a small device, right? So there's death around, and there's survival, and there's hardship, and there's suffering, and there's human beings awakening to what is that? What is this? Like
Yeah.
all this confusion and these ups and downs, emotional roller coasters, deceptions, like they write a lot about, for example, the idea of they make an analogy to like the identification with the false self sort of being like walking down a forest path at night and mistaking a rope laying across the pathway for a snake.
Right.
Yeah. There's a misapprehension of reality, that happens because of that. Mm-hmm. And so they were aware of all these things, and these particular people were specialized in sitting for hours on end in absolute isolation, just trying to figure this stuff out, just trying to figure it out because they see the needless suffering all around them and the hardship of survival in a wild environment, and they're trying to seek a solution to that. The personality that they're seeking the solution through, in the end, becomes the easiest way to dissolve that suffering. Because if you're not completely hyper-focused on the story of yourself, then it's not so indignant when something happens to you. Like, how dare life do that to me? I mean, mm-hmm. me. You can't do that to me. Mm-hmm. God, why do you do this to me?
Why hast thou forsaken me?
Yeah, me. It's all about me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, and so they noticed through that passive awareness that all of these thoughts and things going on were being watched by something that wasn't involved in it. That wasn't caught up in it. It was just watching it. It was experiencing it and
observing.
And so that started to develop the question of, well, what is that? What is that thing that witnesses without being entangled in it? Because it seems to be of such a purity that it's untaintaable. So it was a very very deep insight for a time period that had 1,000th of the information we have, maybe 1,000,000th of the information that we have today. And it was done by people with no special instruments other than themselves, sitting down with an honest, genuine desire to find out what's what,
Yeah.
And so
pretty amazing.
So the main thing would be sort of to realize that it's a confusion of yourself with your story.
Mm-hmm. A misrepresentation of it in your mind.
Yeah. And so the ego itself isn't something necessarily bad, It isn't something necessarily that has to be
doesn't have to be your enemy.
Yeah, you don't have to kill it.
Mm-mm.
No, but it's much easier to play with it without being in danger if you have that clarity. Mm-hmm. You can build up interesting things in your personality. You can change it at a whim whenever you feel like it and stuff. But if inside that clarity remains, then it's completely inconsequential. Whether you still answer to your name or something like it. It's something that I have a little bit of it irks me a little bit about, like quote unquote spiritual people. There was one guy that I used to visit sometimes who was also really into Vedanta and these kinds of things. And I'd come in and I'd be like, hey, how you doing? He'd be like, I don't want to know. Like, all right, cool. Want to drink a tea? I don't know if I want anything. Yeah, but okay, brother, but we can't get anywhere like this, Like it's not real what you're doing there. Yeah, and it's not really real, That to me, like, it stinks of personhood, of like they're trying to control their ego. Don't let it out, but the thing doing the controlling is also the ego.
Yeah.
They haven't seen through that story in a real way yet. So it's not a creative They don't have the playful, creative fun with the ego that was intended.
Right.
You know?
Right. Right.
You know?
You're not going to beat it. You can kind of join it, but yeah, don't let it overtake you. And I think that's, kind of what he was doing, or,
Yeah, or like often the analogy is master and the servant.
On the flip side of the coin, even. Yeah, exactly.
Your mind is a great servant. Don't let it become the master.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That's a good
because
lesson.
it's always missing information. It's always incomplete, because all the mind can do is chop things down into little pieces and then try to recorrelate them. So it's never getting a whole picture of something.
Nope.
The mind is able to stand in front of a waterfall, and it's imagining how many gallons of water are flowing over the waterfall, and like, okay, well, how much water with it? And it's doing that kind of stuff, right? The being is standing in front of the waterfall, completely absorbed in the beauty of the moment. And so we've all reached samadhi before without yoga. If you've ever been completely absorbed in anything in your life, you were in samadhi. Right? If you were so absorbed that you lost the sense of your story self, you were in samadhi.
Right.
Yeah.
We talked about that last season, that moment where you lose track of time. And time seems to just not exist because you're so wrapped up in the moment.
Yeah, at the very least, it becomes irrelevant to the moment.
Yep.
Yeah, and awesome. So that's that nice long series of stages that Patanjali sort of laid out, for this possibility for human beings. Right? What it's turned into since then is another story. It's today, unfortunately, it's a lot of marketing. People are very unclear about things, even whenever they know. They can be intentionally vague, because they need you to come to the next seminar and the next seminar and the next class and the next class, because their livelihood's dependent on it.
Yeah.
And that's not a very good thing, where their sense of power is dependent on it, or their sense of worth, self-worth is dependent on it. And all of these kinds of things are people who maybe have like an intellectual grasp on what it means, but they haven't actually gone inside and checked it out.
Yeah. So go inside and check it out. Ain't
nothing gonna happen. It's all good. Get in there. There's no crazy dragon gonna come out of nowhere and cause you to go insane and send you into a mental hospital. That's the mind using fear tactics to keep itself as the primacy of self.
Yeah, it'll play some tricks.
It's fighting for its life.
Yeah. Absolutely. Man, I think that's a good stopping point. Is there anything else you wanted to add as we wrap up this season here?
I would put my little end touch on the whole thing of, you don't have to do this through yoga, right? This season was dedicated to how we get there within the yogic system. Next season will be how we get there within another system.
Yeah.
Or within another philosophical idea, or another religious tradition, or the shamanic traditions of indigenous people, or whatever that might be. What's interesting is that the sort of the blend of Patanjali and Buddha can get us there with the most clarity the fastest. So that where the objectives are very clear and you're doing specific exercises to do certain things.
Yeah.
Some other traditions have their expositions in a more dreamlike language. It's much more poetry. It's much more intended to create sort of a sense of truth rather than like a clear intellectual view of it. Yeah. So that would be the last thing I would add to it, is that if you've chosen yoga as your path, good for you. It's a good one. You can get there. If you've chosen something else, good for you. Take some of the ideas that we've talked about and start trying to apply them to your own traditions. Ask questions. If you get good at asking questions, you'll figure out whatever it is that you need to figure out. So.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thanks again, everyone, for listening and watching. It's been fun. It's been really informative. I appreciate all you've shared, Mr. Monk, and I look forward to our future discussions and conversations as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you too, brother.
Yeah. One love, baby. All right. Well, everybody take care of themselves out there, and we will see you soon. Mr. Ego, Feral Monk out.